I came to persuade you to avoid these dangers.
We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal.
We must find a path forward where they will have a future that is very different than their past.
He will become the founder of a mighty empire.
The fate of unborn millions now depends under God upon the conduct and courage of this army.
Various founders talked about this providential experiment that God had ordained and intervened at this unique moment in American history to make all of this happen.
Most of them believed that there were no accidents in history.
That hope for liberty was the light that under God, He would lead them.
All eyes are opened or opening to the rights of man.
Am I all mankind?
We have been assured, sir, in the sacred writings, that except the Lord build the house, they labor in vain that build it.
It cannot be denied that with America and in America, a new era commences in human affairs.
Americans of today should regain our bearings, that our nation is no accident.
Well, I'm here with Tim Mahoney, Steve Meyer, Robert P. George. We're going to be talking about this new documentary. This is a movie that is going to be coming out pretty soon, The American Miracle. I'm actually really excited about this podcast because I just finished watching the movie last night, and I feel like I learned so much, and I just have gotten so many insights through the movie about the history of this country and about this, how this country started. So I just want to jump right into it. Tim, I'll start with you. You directed this film, and I'm just wondering, what was attractive to you about this story, The American Miracle?
Well, I've been working with the concept of does God act in history? And that's how I met Michael Medved. I had made a film called Patterns of Evidence, The Exodus, and he was in that first film. And I was searching for a pattern of evidence of God acting in history. And over the years, I've known him. And when I learned about The American Miracle, and he by him introducing it to me, he said, "Tim, would you help me tell this story? You've done so well with the Patterns films." And I thought and prayed about it. And as I looked at the project, I could see it was just a different millennium that I had been working in, and that's what made me interested in it. And by the way, Stephen Meyer and I worked on the Patterns of Evidence films in the early days too.
Really?
And so I've been familiar with Stephen, and it was a pleasure to meet Robert George. And so this film seemed like the next. It was a relief in some ways to move out of ancient Egypt and Israel into the American Revolution, of which I was very interested in, and history in general.
Yes. Well, one of the interesting things in this movie was the fact that it seemed like, as I was watching it, it seemed like everything that I had learned, and I'm only 25, so I kind of grew up through the public school system in Madison, Wisconsin, so very, very progressive. It felt like as I was watching it, a lot of the things that I had previously thought or had heard about the American Revolution, about the Founding Fathers, what you guys were saying, I guess, made it sound like what I had learned was not true. One of these things is that a lot of the Founding Fathers were just deists, or they didn't really believe in God, or they just, were sort of atheistic. But it sounds like that's actually not the case. Steve, I guess I'll go to you on this. Can you kind of talk about George Washington and the idea that he wasn't just a deist? He didn't just believe in some sort of abstract, non-influential God, but that he actually had some sort of faith. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. Deism is the system of thought or worldview, religious belief system that affirms the existence of a God, a God who is in one sense personal, in that God is the deistic God is an intelligent agent of some kind. But the key idea of deism is that God created the universe at the beginning and set it up in such a way that it would essentially run on its own without any divine intervention, without God acting in time and space and history. And this is exactly the opposite of the worldview of the founders. Many of them were, of course, Orthodox Christians of one denomination or another. And even the ones that were less explicitly religious, as Professor George described Ben Franklin correctly in the film. They still had a very strong belief in providence, which is the idea that God does intervene in the affairs of men. And in the film, there's a particularly beautiful scene near the end where there's an impasse at the Constitutional Convention. And the least explicitly religious member of the convention, Benjamin Franklin, rises and enjoins the delegates to pray. And he says, the longer he has lived, he says, the more convinced he is that God intervenes in the affairs of men. And so this is the worldview of the founders is not deistic. Some were what you might call non-religiously practicing theists who believed in a God who intervened in nature. But most were Christians of some stripe or another, and all believed in this notion of a God who was active in history. You see this repeatedly in the writings of Washington in particular. He had a very strong sense of that as he was fighting against all odds in the Revolutionary War. And then the story of the founding itself is beautifully told, and it's also a story of providence.
Robert, can you explain where this idea came from that the founders were Christians? Where did that come from? Why do people actually say that? And why do they teach that in the schools? That's what I learned.
Well, I wish I could say this in a more polite way than I'm about to say it, but sure. It's no secret that for quite some time now, the academic establishment has been secular and progressive. And I think that is a large part of the explanation of why the religious beliefs of the founders, including the explicitly Christian beliefs of many of the founders, have been erased from the teaching of American history, and they're depicted as almost caricatures of, quote, Enlightenment, unquote, ideologies that have at most the thinnest patina of religion, but the reality is that they're really not believers. The truth of the matter is some were very devout believers. John Jay, one of the three writers of the Federalist Papers, the first Chief Justice of the Supreme Court of the United States, was what we would today call an evangelical Christian. Charles Carroll of Carrollton, the only Catholic signer of the Declaration of Independence, was a Catholic believer. And there were many others. And even the least devout or least explicitly religious, men like Jefferson and, as Steve Meyer just said, Ben Franklin, were far from atheists or even strictly speaking deists. As Steve just said, Franklin, the older he got, the more convinced he became that God was active in the affairs of men. That the picture of God that we have in the Bible as being involved in human affairs, caring about human affairs, intervening, a providential God, that's the God Franklin believed in. As far as I can tell, there wasn't a single atheist among the American founders. Now, that's not because atheism was unknown. There were plenty of atheists, especially among the sophisticated in Europe, most particularly in France. But they were not counted among the American founders. Again, even the least devout, the least explicitly religious, the least orthodox were far from being atheists.
The idea that God is involved in the affairs of men, that's obviously where the film starts, is where the movie starts, but it really focuses it on George Washington, and you go through some of these stories of him as a younger man, and sort of this idea that like George Washington just like couldn't die. He just had all of these situations in which he stays alive as if there's something that God has planned for him later on in his life. Tim, can you, tell us why you started the film that way? Why did you want to set the precedent in using George Washington's life as an example of God's providence?
A film like this, which covers a broad, time period, it covers from 1750 all the way through to, Robert, you could help me with when the Constitution was finally signed. Was that 1823? Oh, I'm sorry, 17.
Oh, no.
17. I meant 17.
1789, and then the Bill of Rights, 1791. Yeah, Constitution proposed in 1787.
Yeah, I knew that. I was thinking about we also talk about the first 50 years in the film. So the film opens up with a scene that is 1826, and it's the 50th anniversary. I think it's 1826, right?
Yeah, that's right. The 50th anniversary to the day of the Declaration of Independence.
Yeah. So when you get a book and you turn it into a movie, you're working on trying to be faithful to the book as well as trying to be good at telling a story that's a movie story, without lots of with a book you can go from chapter to chapter and kind of jump around, but for some reason it's not that easy when you make a movie. And so George Washington, I could see, and it wasn't necessarily written this way, but I could see that he was the thread. I believe that in many ways, and if you think about it, he was the Moses, and I was familiar with working with Moses for a long time, but Washington really seemed to be the physical leader and the spiritual leader, if I were to say that, of the nation. And I think that his courage, I think he was prepared, and I think he knew he had a calling on his life. I've been reading about his, a younger man, how there were virtuous things that he believed in, and they were sown into him. And so then when I looked at the script and the book, I realized that also that I didn't know a lot of this. And I took the opportunity to say, well, let's pick Washington as the thread through the film as a personality. And then we're going to also put a timeline on the film so you would know where we were in history. And a lot of films that I make, people are lost because they just can't follow you. And so what this film will enable you to do is to follow history and see, well, it was kind of a basic primer. That was my hope. It was, well, how did the revolution get started? What were we fighting for? What were the key points of God's providence in America in this founding? And then why did they fight? And that's when I used that, the great line that Robert had, they needed to constitute themselves. and that's when the Constitution comes into play. And so I knew that we had to make that bridge as a filmmaking story. And Washington is in that all the way through with a host of other characters as well.
Mm-hmm. And he couldn't. And so I think it's the first sort of instance or in which George Washington dodges death was with the smallpox. Is that correct? Can you explain, or I guess give a little bit of insight into that story with the smallpox, Steve?
Oh, for me, I'm not as familiar with the historical details there. I came a little later in the film, commenting more on this deism question. But, I found that illuminating too. Apparently, he was. Contracted smallpox as a young man. His half brother died from the disease. They got it together, and he survived, and that gave him an immunity through the rest of his life. And of course, the Native Americans. He was in the French Indian War, and other times were sort of amazed that he seemed to be immune from other forms of peril as well. So,
I mean, there are constantly bullets whirring around his head, horses being shot out from under him, bullet holes going through his sleeves, and somehow he's uninjured.
Yes. And what happened in that scene, that was the very first day of filming. And we went to the actual battle location. And I think what you might not realize is that the Native Americans that played the role are the actual descendants of the tribe.
Wow.
and they're wearing the the clothing of the tribe and the makeup and everything. I mean, I just felt that we had to honor this story in as many ways to be authentic. So when you're seeing it, and I look through the lens, look through the monitors and everything, and I could, you could see what it was like, and so all the costume periods as well were accurate. We had James Gallagher, a historian, who had worked on Turn and John Adams, and he worked with Spielberg on Lincoln. He was our historian, and I actually called him thinking I was calling about cannons, and then he says, "Well, do you know what I do?" And he's retired Air Force colonel, and I said, "No," and he says, "Well, I work on these films." I said, "I need your help. I want this to be accurate." And so that story of Washington, I think the other two, reality of that was, I think the thing that gave me chills was the campfire scene when the chief comes in years later. I don't know if anybody wants to contribute on that, Robert, but there was a prophecy that was given to Washington by a Native American chief. And, he said, we tried to shoot you and rifles that were true, could not, this man cannot die in battle. And it just shows you, I think it encourages you that I think when we hear from the different historians that are in the film, that Washington knew he was chosen for something special. And I think that's what this is so important to realize that. And I think I often, when I talk about this film, talk about it being the forgotten story. And that's why it's important to tell this forgotten story, because that God is all over it.
Yeah.
Washington really was the indispensable man. You take Washington out of the picture, you do not get a successful revolution against, after all, the greatest military power on earth at the time. Steve mentioned earlier that the revolution was fought against all odds, and that is absolutely true. It was almost certain defeat, after which the American founders whom we venerate today would all have been hanged as traitors to the king. So they were fighting what really seemed to the world, and even to them at a certain level, as a kind of hopeless cause. But of course, they kept their faith strong. They believed in their cause. They were willing to die if necessary for the cause. But you can replace just about everybody else and still get the outcome. You can't replace Washington. If he's not in the picture, you don't get a successful revolution. You do not get the founding of a successful republic, one that next year we'll be celebrating the 250th anniversary of, an unheard of in human history. I mean, there have been republics all through human history. They've all failed. And very often when they failed, collapsed into the worst forms of tyranny. Washington made this possible. Now, George Washington was not the most brilliant founder. He didn't have the intellect of Adams, for example, who I regard to be the most brilliant of the founders, certainly the greatest scholar of the founders. Sometimes Jefferson is thought to be that. He wasn't. He's a very smart man. He's a good scholar, but Adams was the greatest scholar. He wasn't especially charismatic, actually, but there was something about him that commanded everyone's respect. Something about him, when people engaged with him, when they looked at him, they knew that this was a great man. This was a special figure. And of course, the decisions that Washington made, not only in the revolution, but then as president, made possible the success of the American experiment. For example, when he was urged by Adams, for example, to use as his mode of address, or the mode of address for him, "Your Excellency," he said, "No, that's not a mode of address fit for the leader of a republic. No, call me Mr. President. Address me and future presidents as Mr. President." And on all of those decisions, Washington knew he was setting the precedents for the future. He was doing the things that would enable the republic to succeed in the future, even to the point of not running for a third term in office. He did not want to be effectively a king because he didn't want to establish that precedent or put the republic at risk by doing something like that, a kind of president for life. When he turned over power, he did it twice, returned power. No one had done that before. No great leader of a revolution or of a war had done that before. When George III heard that Washington was going to return power to Congress after succeeding in the revolution, George III said, if he does that, he will be the greatest man on earth. And he did that, and he was the greatest man on earth.
There's a interesting...
Andy, I would like to add something to that, and it has to do with what happened at Trenton. When Washington crossed, I mean, I don't think anyone really realizes that when the British, in the very first, we show this scene of this escape across, I believe it's the East River, and when Washington they tried to defend New York, and why this is significant. There's a book, I think it's Washington's Crossing, that when I make a film, I try to read all the other scholars and get insights, and so the British. As has been told by Robert, they could have all hung. I mean, this was treason, and guess what? As I understand it, Robert, the British executed almost everybody as they came in, and Washington and his group were up on the and dug in there, and then providentially we show this providence of a fog coming in, and saving them. But then they're on the other side of the river, and then they have to make a decision not too much after that. On Christmas Eve, against all odds, they decide to attack. And if you realize how desperate that was, the courage of Washington to turn around and attack. But not only did he attack, but he only attacked with part of the group that was supposed to attack, because one of them decided not to attack, and I think he went off to Philadelphia because he figured it was going to lose. Isn't that correct, Robert?
That's correct.
One of the generals did. But here's the point I'm going to make. It has to do with the virtue, because when they captured Trenton, they could have been brutal. They could have been executed everyone. Because that's what you do in war in a lot of people's movies that they make, right? It's revenge. But he said, we're not that people. We are civil, we're not that kind of people. And I think when I read that, my understanding of who Washington was and what he brought to the entire nation was a standard that was a virtuous standard. And I think it had to do with how he thought and what he had read, and we're living in a violent culture right now. And Washington said, "This is not the way we're going to live. We're not going to treat our enemies this way." And that to me was so impressive, how he reacted. And I think he set the tone for the nation, and the courage in the face of almost defeat to do that. The crossing of the Delaware, which we show in the movie, to me was a sign of an amazing leader, and then how he responded to his enemies. That to me was incredibly significant.
He had a very profound sense of dignity and a very profound sense of the importance of virtue. He trained himself in this in part by studying very carefully when he was young a manual that was composed by priests of the Jesuit order back in the late 16th century. It was called Rules of Civility and Decent Behavior. And that applied not just to the rules of politesse when we engage with each other, or whether you use this fork or that fork for the fish at dinner. They had to do with things like how you treat other human beings, even in war. What a civilized person, what a civilized society does and won't do. Sure. The virtue was and the cultivation of virtue was a critically important aspect of Washington's life. He worked on it through his entire life. He knew he had some dangerous flaws. He was very self-aware. He knew he had a terrible temper. And he worked very hard to keep it under control. And most of the time he did. But when he lost it, on the rare occasions when he did lose his temper, he really lost it. He was right about himself. He did have a terrible temper, and he worked hard to cultivate those virtues so that he could keep it in check.
Yeah. There's an interesting, I guess, connection between providence and prayer. If you believe that God works in the affairs of men, then you're going to interact with God. You're going to pray. You're going to talk to him, and you're going to ask that he would interact with the things that you're interacting with. And, to the sort of narrative that's been given to us that these guys were deists, or that a lot of them didn't even believe in the Christian God or anything like that. It's very interesting that George Washington actually prayed. Like, if he didn't believe in the God of the Bible, why would you pray? If you didn't believe in a providential God, why would you pray? I guess Stephen, you've talked about the deist idea, but do deists and agnostics, do they usually pray and ask God to intervene in the affairs of men?
If you're a deist, strictly speaking, there's no point in prayer because God has left the world to work on its own. One of the famous deists of the Enlightenment period, Alexander Pope, said, "Whatever is right," because the way that the world was set up at the beginning is the way it was meant to be, and it's just unfolding in this completely deterministic way. Tim originally approached me about being involved in the film because I'm best known for my work on intelligent design in biology, intelligent design in cosmology. And Michael, initially, when he published The American Miracle, he had proposed as a subtitle, Intelligent Design in American History. And the publishers were a little nervous about that because our work's been a bit controversial. But so they used the word providence instead. But there's a beautiful line near the end of the film where Michael explains the thesis of his book and therefore of the film. And that is that when you see a series of extremely improbable events, all working to accomplish the same end, the same discernible end, all working in favor of a particular outcome, we, in our ordinary way of reasoning, invariably perceive a design in that. If you think of a person winning at the same hand of cards, or winning in a card game again and again and again, after a while you begin to suspect cheating, that there's some collusion behind it. There's some, and so there's a formal theory of intelligent design that one of our brilliant mathematicians has developed, and he uses some technical terminology. He calls it a small probability specification, where the specification is the discernible end, and the small probability is the accumulation of the one improbable condition or event after another. And when we encounter events like that, we invariably perceive a mind behind it. And so Michael was making this very subtle design argument in his book about American history. But at the end, he equates the notion of design and providence together. What was fun for me was that what Tim didn't know in approaching me is that though I've done most of my work in the philosophy of science, I taught political philosophy for years. And I love the story of the founding, in part because it illustrates the worldview that informed the Constitution and the Declaration. And so if you separate the whole question of how many of the founders were Christians, how many were I would say there were some that were non-explicitly religious theists, but not deists. They believed in a God that was active in history. But even if you separate that, you can see the influence of the Judeo-Christian worldview on the founding, the biblical notions. And Tim had a soundbite from my interview where I explained that I used to tell my students that I call them the twin pillars of constitutional thought. One was the idea of intrinsic dignity, that humans had an intrinsic dignity that was built into them as a consequence of having been created in the image of God. This notion of dignitas was a religious notion that went back to Genesis, that we were made in God's image. And because of that, we had rights that were not granted by the government, could not be granted by government. Government could only protect them. They were granted by God in virtue of being made in God's image. And so the object of the government was to protect those rights. But there was a challenge that all the founders recognized, because as Professor George explained so beautifully in the film, the founders were aware of the deep flaws in human nature. Yeah. That in addition to having dignity, we were depraved. There was this penchant towards harming the dignity of others. And so so there was this very difficult question: how do we give government enough power to control the governed, and at the same time oblige it to control itself. That's a quote from the Federalist Papers.
Yep.
And this was, and the answer to that was this beautiful system of checks and balances, of the distribution of power across the three branches of government, having a federal, state, and local level. So power was distributed to protect against absolute power corrupting absolutely. Well, where does that idea come from? That's the idea also from Genesis of the fall of man. You have these twin ideas, this very subtle, nuanced view of human nature that comes out of the Judeo-Christian tradition, out of the Hebrew Bible and the New Testament. And the founders had even those who were not explicitly practicing had imbibed that worldview. Madison was trained at the College of New Jersey, what's now Princeton, where Professor George is a distinguished professor, and he trained under Witherspoon, who was a Scottish Presbyterian. Wow. And the Presbyterians were not only very strong on the notion of human dignity, but they especially emphasized the depravity of man. So he got both those twin pillars in his thinking early, and then gave political expression to them in the founding documents. And so that's a big part of the story too. So there's the virtue of the characters, the providential coincidences that gave rise to the Republic, and also the form of thinking that was enshrined in these political documents, both the Declaration and the Constitution. And I think Tim just does a beautiful job telling that story, both through historical reenactments that have you on the edge of your seat. It feels like a Hollywood movie, but then he brings in some of these scholars and historians to illuminate the audience as to what they're actually seeing.
Mm-hmm. A couple of points there. One, just to make sure that our viewers and listeners don't misunderstand what Steve said about Alexander Pope. He was quoting Pope on deism. He was not saying that Pope was
exactly right. Yeah, thank you. Yeah,
Pope was a Christian. Pope was a Catholic. On Washington and prayer, something people seem to forget is that Washington was a vestryman at his church. In fact, two churches over the course of his adult life. In Virginia, in those days, it was originally known as an Anglican church, and then it became known as the Episcopal Church. And of course, that's a church that, even in its Protestant manifestation, is a liturgical church. And so he would have been accustomed to liturgical forms of prayer and would have regularly, said his prayers in the liturgical context. So he was not. In this respect, he's unlike Franklin. Franklin didn't belong to a church. Jefferson didn't belong to a church. I think they're in that category that Steve described a few minutes ago as being theists, but not specifically Christian theists who were associated with a church. Washington was a Christian believer associated with a denomination, a Christian church, the Anglican and then Episcopal Church.
Andy, I had heard all the things that you had heard about the founders, religious beliefs or lack thereof, and took my son. But then in 2009, I took my son to see Mount Vernon, and was kind of shocked to see that on where the Martha and George were buried, on the place where they had inserted the coffins into the wall, you had "I am the resurrection and the life" from John 11. So the very explicit affirmation of Christian belief, not a nominal belief, but a very. So I think this story, it's been the object of a lot of revisionism that has deprived our students and all of us of an awareness of just what these where the founders got their deepest founding principles.
I'll tell you, among my more secular and progressive academic colleagues, I think there has been now for decades a temptation to remake the founders in their own image and likeness.
Right, exactly.
Right? The founders seem like them.
Yes.
One other example of that struck me is on this same trip in 2009, we went to the Jefferson Memorial. And on the memorial, you have quotations from Jefferson, who is, maybe hypocritically or otherwise, but he is lamenting the institution of slavery. And he says he fears for his nation because it will a just God forbear from judgment indefinitely over such an abomination. That's sort of an idea. Well, just gods don't intervene in deism. This is Jefferson, I think, clearly was not a Christian, a practicing Christian, but he was certainly not a deist. He was I would characterize him as a non-religious theist, and that's, if you will, on the left wing of the founders. And,
I'll give you, Steve, the exact quote, and he was talking about slavery. He being Jefferson, and it's not just I fear. He said, "I tremble for my country." When I reflect that God is just and that his justice will not sleep forever. Here's a man who owned slaves, who did not favor the abolition of slavery, believed that slavery was a necessary evil. We're stuck with it, at least for now. We can't get rid of it. And yet he knew that it was a grave evil, one that God would someday call us to account, call our nation to account for. And then if you just, move ahead to Abraham Lincoln's second inaugural address. There you find Lincoln, another person who did not belong to a church, but certainly believed in an act of God who was active in history. What does Lincoln say about slavery? He's kind of fulfilling Jefferson's prediction. He says, we all know that slavery was the cause of this war. In some way, it was the cause of this war. And it was a judgment. The war was a judgment that God brought on our nation, both North and South, for the sin of slavery.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I've been telling Tim that's the next film he needs to make. The second inaugural is one of the most beautiful pieces of political writing, but it's not just a political speech. It's a piece of theodicy. Mm-hmm. Lincoln is explaining to the nation how a just God could allow the horrific outcome of the Civil War. And he said, this isn't on God, this is on us. And it's an argument, in a sense, a theological argument for the justice of God in the face of what people have been suffering. So
I think for me, boy, what you have all said is so significant. And we have been stolen from by a narrative that does not tell the truth. Mm-hmm. I don't know how else to say it. I mean, I did this with when I was dealing with the Exodus. There are narratives that have been out there in the last 50, 60 years or longer that have aggressively gone to either only tell partial of what someone is and leave out the rest. I mean, and so, there's something called errors and omission in a film. It's called errors and omission insurance you get. It's the errors and the omissions of things that should have been said. And what has happened is that we have a nation of people that have huge errors in history and omission. Am I saying anything wrong here? I think that's the case. And that's the reason why that's why I'm so thankful to have had the opportunity and the privilege to tell this story. And we had to make a decision. Is this a drama or is this going to be a docudrama? And I believe that the testimony that Steve and Robert and Joseph Ellis and others have given, and Michael.
Richard Dreyfuss,
yes.
Akil Amar from Yale.
Yes, Akil. Right. All of these, there's 17 contributors. Their testimony had to be in there because so much dramatic film is fiction. Historical films are fictional. They're not really true things that happen. And so we wanted to have that testimony there, say, yeah, this is exactly what happened. And that's exactly what they said. And for me, that's why seeing the film is so important, because people take their storylines now through film, and they're not going to read books as much as they used to for many young people. So that's why the film is so important. That's why, talking about this, the film is going to be in theaters June 9, 10, and 11th nationwide. If you go to American Miracle Movie, AmericanMiracleMovie.com, you can buy tickets, and the tickets today, actually, it's May 2nd, they're on sale. So for people that would like to get it I would encourage you to bring, your family, bring your friends. This is such a significant film to prepare us, I think, to appreciate and give thanks for this incredible nation that we have. That's what Michael really wanted. He wanted people to give thanks for what we have received. And
Andy, if I could weigh in there too, I've been interviewed for a number of documentaries over the years, and I thought this was a fascinating project. I loved Michael's book. But then when I watched the film, I realized that Tim had created a kind of unique genre here in which you have the testimony of experts who are helping to illuminate and interpret the events that you're seeing, but the historical, the dramatic aspect of the film really carries you. It's very watchable and very interesting. The drama of the founding and of the revolution are very well told. And then you have figures like Professor George and Richard Dreyfuss. And I had Shabbat with the Medveds a little while ago when they were thanking me for participating. And Michael said, well, we'll give you a Best Supporting Actor award. And I said, no, that's Professor George and Richard Dreyfuss. They really carried it. Robbie, you were just fantastic, actually. I was so moved by some of the things you said. And it was so it kind of all worked beautifully together. I think Tim created almost a unique genre of filmmaking here to weave the two things together so seamlessly. So it's a history lesson, but one that I think will move people.
We do need to tell each new generation our story, our nation's story. It's a remarkable story by any standards. But I think whether we're scholars, whether we're filmmakers, whether we're biographers, whether we're politicians speaking at public events or whatever, I think the basic obligation that we all have is to tell the truth and tell the whole truth and tell nothing but the truth. And our history has some very dark aspects. There are things that we're not proud of and we shouldn't be proud of. But it's also got glorious aspects. There's slavery, but there's the great struggle to overcome and abolish slavery. There's segregation, but there's the great successful struggle to overcome Jim Crow and other aspects of racial injustice. We don't want to whitewash our history, but we also don't want to pretend that our history has been a history of nothing but exploitation and repression and abuse and suppression and racism and hatred. That's not true. So just tell the whole truth, the glorious parts and the far from glorious parts. And that's what I like about the film. I mean, the film really does tell the truth. Now, there's no way you can tell the whole truth at once, right? And there are always choices that you have to make because they're interpretations of history. And here we just have to do our best to be fair, and then reasonable people are going to disagree about different interpretations. But there are a lot of things where, this either happened or it didn't happen. And we just have to tell the truth about those things. And if we tell the truth about this thing, it could be one of the glorious things or one of the embarrassing things. We have to tell the truth about the other thing, the embarrassing thing or the glorious thing. Just tell the truth.
And I think one of the things that comes through very strongly, in part because of Robbie's testimony, is that the principles upon which the nation was founded were good principles, godly principles, as he said. And when we have adhered to those principles, we've done well, we've flourished, we've been blessed. And when we've diverted from them, we've had crisis, and the Civil War was just such a crisis. But that's the right balance. The principles are good. We humans don't always adhere to them in a way that is good, and so it's that tension. But the founders expected that. That was the nuanced view of human nature that they had. That we were capable of great nobility. We were made in the image of a good creator, but we were also prone to depravity, and therefore the reason our system has been, I think, so durable is that they had a correct view of human nature. Aristotle said long ago that the job of the political philosopher is to understand human nature and to build a system of government that's consistent with it. And this is what I think the founders did. And this comes through in the film, I think, very, very strongly, especially at the end.
You know, we get so accustomed to hearing the familiar phrases, such as the great second sentence of the Declaration of Independence about "we hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal." We hear them so often, we take them for granted. It's good from time to time to just stop and reflect. Just think of that sentence. Think of it slowly and think of it in historical context. We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal, that every member of the human family is created equal. People realize how revolutionary that thought is. For most of human history, in most cultures, people believed that there were natural superiors and inferiors, ranks. Some people were better than others, castes. It's a radical notion, clearly derived from the Judeo-Christian tradition and the teaching at the beginning of the Bible, very first chapter of the very first book of the Bible, Genesis, that men are made in the image and likeness of God. But it's a radical notion. We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal. There aren't inferiors and superiors. That no matter how different we are and how unequal we are in strength, beauty, intelligence, charm, skill, fortunes, wealth, we're still in the most fundamental respect, in respect of our basic dignity, equal. The lowliest person, the person with a cognitive disability, the disabled person, the person who's looked down on by others, the person who may be drug addicted, the person who may be mentally ill, is still nevertheless the equal in dignity of the greatest scholar, the most gifted athlete, the most beautiful model or actress. It's a radical notion. And we hold that all men are created equal and that they're endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights. Unalienable means the government didn't give them to you, as Steve said earlier, and therefore the government cannot legitimately take them away. Their source is from a power greater than any human power. And so no merely human power can legitimately violate them. Again, that's a radical notion. You can search through history and cultures. And this doesn't mean that we are better than other people, but we are very blessed to have those principles. And as Steve said a moment ago, if you look at our history, we have nothing to be ashamed of or embarrassed about when we have been faithful to our principles. What we have to be embarrassed and ashamed about are the moments when we failed to live up to those principles. Slavery fails to live up to those principles. Segregation fails to live up to those principles. The fight against segregation and slavery, that's living up to those principles.
And the source of that, spiritually and intellectually, to oppose slavery came from the founding documents, which in turn came from the Judeo-Christian tradition. The other thing I'd add to what Professor Georges just said is that it's the idea of intrinsic dignity, of universal equality, was not just radical in its time. It's been radical even into our recent times. If you think of the whole Soviet communist experiment, there was a law professor, Harold Berman at Harvard for a long time, who talks explicitly about the distinction between the two systems, that in this American system, rights are granted by God and can only be protected by government. But in the Soviet system, the rights were granted by the Soviet state, and therefore they could be taken away by the Soviet state. So this idea of an intrinsic dignity that is the basis of our universal equality is something that has been radical throughout history, right up to the present.
So Steve brought a smile to my face by mentioning the name of Harold Berman, Hal Berman, as I knew him. He was my professor at Harvard Law School.
You're
we
kidding.
were very close. Yeah, we were very close. I learned an enormous amount from him. And he had two specialties in legal scholarship. One was Soviet law, and that was a rare thing. I mean, very few American legal scholars knew anything about Soviet law, and he was an expert on it, which meant that he really did know what he was talking about when he compared the Soviet and American legal systems. And the other area of expertise for Hal was the development of Western law, the Western legal tradition. And here he was very clear. You only get a system of law like ours if you begin with a basic worldview of the sort that's set forth in the Bible. It's the biblical understanding of anthropology, that is of human nature, that is of man, concept of man made in the image and likeness of God, weak and fallen, but nevertheless the bearer of profound, inherent, and equal dignity. It's only with that understanding that you get the system of law protective of rights, what we would today call human rights, in an earlier generation called natural rights, that we enjoy. That's the great blessing for all of us, giving us the freedoms and opportunities that we have in this country. Andy said something a moment ago when we were offline about how so many members of his generation, Andy's in his mid-20s, dismiss the American founders. They dismiss Washington and Jefferson and Adams and Hamilton and Madison and the others on the grounds that, well, they either supported slavery or they didn't fight hard enough against slavery, and therefore what do they know about justice or morality, so we can just ignore them, we can write them off, we have nothing to learn from them. It's very opposite of the truth. As a matter of fact, men like Adams and Hamilton were strongly opposed to slavery. They had to make a conscious decision to say, well, look, in order to put slavery on the road to extinction, we need to found this republic, and we're going to have to do a compromise with the South, with slaveholders, in order to get a republic in place. But that doesn't mean we're going to live with slavery forever. Our best chance of actually getting rid of slavery is to found a genuine regime of republican government that can then, in the course of time, abolish slavery. And even for those who were not opposed to slavery, at least weren't wanting to dismantle slavery immediately, people like Jefferson and Washington, who were slaveholders themselves, they knew slavery was wrong. But in Jefferson's words, slavery was like having a wolf by the ears. We know we can't hold it, but we dare not let go of it. They thought it was a necessary evil, but even they thought eventually it would die out. We only got the positive defense of slavery in a later generation in the 19th century, when technological changes, especially in automation, when it came to agriculture, made slavery basically profitable again and gave slavery a new lease on life. And then people began to justify race-based chattel slavery not as a necessary evil, but as a positive good. And you get the development of this crazy pseudoscience, which a lot of very respectable scientists believed in the 19th century, about how blacks were mentally inferior and they were only fit for a life of slavery and all that idiocy. But it was considered sophisticated science in its day. People who regarded themselves as children of the Enlightenment believed stuff like that.
Well,
can I just one final point
a lot
on
of
this?
that came out of social Darwinism. It didn't find its roots in the Judeo-Christian tradition that gave rise to the founding. It was a completely different worldview that justified and informed that way of thinking.
That's right. These were people who rejected the biblical testimony that man is made in the image and likeness of God, and therefore all human beings bear profound, inherent, and equal dignity. Their thought was, well, no. Human beings are not made in the image and likeness of God, if there is a God, which there probably isn't from the point of view of these people. And therefore, there are better and worse people, superiors and inferiors. That gives you the defense of slavery. And only a couple of generations later, Steve, would give you the defense of eugenics.
Exactly.
Which was not a defense offered by religious folk, was not a defense offered even by, working class people. It was a defense offered by the so-called great and the good, the secular big intellectuals, the leaders of the great foundations, the heads of universities like the one at which I teach, Princeton University and Harvard University and so forth. There's the wonderful book by my Princeton colleague Thomas Leonard called Illiberal Reformers shows eugenics was not the product of religious belief or religious doctrine. It was the product of the rejection of religious doctrine by people who thought that they were beyond all that and were the leaders of Enlightenment values who would put science at the center of our understanding and put all these old religious superstitions into the past.
Could you give a definition of eugenics for
yes.
Like that? No.
Yeah. So this was the movement that begins to emerge in the 19-teens here in the United States and in places like Germany, which held that we now live in an age of science. Among the things science will enable us to do is to decide who is better and worse, who is more and less fit, and therefore more or less worthy of the advantages of living in civil society. The eugenicists thought that some people, because they were inferior, should not be allowed to reproduce, not be allowed to have children. That we want children from the fit, from the better people, from the smarter people, because we want to breed people who are better, who are smarter, who are stronger, who are prettier, and so forth. And you even get the notion by early eugenicists that there were some lives that were so poor because people were so stupid or so weak or so diminished that they were lives not worthy of living, lives not worthy of life. In German, Leben sonst wird dem Leben, which slogan we identify today with the Nazis because they picked it up and ran, but it did not begin with the Nazis, Tim. That slogan was not invented by the Nazis. That idea of lives unworthy of life, it was invented by sophisticated, smart, affluent, well-educated, progressive people. Like the law professor and medical professor Karl Binding and Alfred Hoche in Germany, who wrote a whole book defending the concept of killing lives unworthy of life.
Yes.
Eugenics was only really discredited and progressives began to run away from it after the Nazis took the ball and ran with it and gave it a bad name. But progressives these days, I notice, want to rewrite history and ignore their own movement's role in bringing about the eugenics that we now today rightly revile and condemn. Have I told the story basically correctly, Steve?
Well, absolutely. And it was a form of applied evolutionary thinking, if you will. People were trying to help the evolutionary process along by, instead of just letting nature do the selecting, we would help the selection process to weed out the feeble and the infirm and the unfit. The notion of fitness was a Darwinian notion, and people, this was a kind of social Darwinist movement where you were going to ensure that the outcome of the competition for survival favored the nation in some way. I have a colleague, John West, who's written an excellent book on this called Darwin Day in America, and it tells the story. It's shocking how much eugenics, both positive and negative eugenics, was being practiced here in the United States, and it was precisely right that it was only the horror of the death camps that caused us to recoil from this practice and then and cause it to come into disrepute. But from the 19-teens right up to World War II, there was both forms of eugenics taking place in the United States.
And it was supported, as I say, by the sophisticated, the highly educated, the highly placed, the progressive, and it was opposed by who? The Catholic Church and people that we would today regard, would use the label evangelical
fundamentalist,
Christians. And how were they treated by the proponents of eugenics? They were looked down upon as being ill-educated, anti-science,
scientifically,
mired in superstition.
But there's a parallel today.
Like to remember that, but
there were any number of Ivy League biology professors who were in the vanguard of this eugenics movement. It's shocking, but
Steve, you will be familiar with a biology textbook once used in high schools called A Civic Biology.
Right.
You know what that textbook is, right? It was the textbook that was at issue in the famous Tennessee
Scopes trial.
The Scopes trial. Now, Steve, let me try this one out on you and see if you agree with me. I think that book would be banned if anybody tried to introduce it into high schools today. It would be banned just as Tennessee tried to ban
ironic,
the use of
isn't it? Yeah.
Isn't it? Yeah. Now, why would it be banned? It was banned in Tennessee because it was promoting Darwinian evolutionary theory. Am I right?
Right.
And it would be banned today because
it's
it
promoting
is
racism
with eugenics. Eugenics ideology and racism. Exactly right.
But
so try who wants to be Clarence Darrow today and try to defend the use of a civic biology in American public high schools? That would be fun. It'd be fun to watch.
Robbie, somebody's asked me to do an op-ed on the 100th anniversary of the Scopes trial coming up. I might use that as an angle. That's really interesting.
I want to connect this a little bit. I mean, a lot of what you're saying is, it's very interesting, and it feels like it connects directly to the modern conversation around abortion. And this is sort of what's been frustrating to me, is that a lot of the critiques of slavery that you'll hear from progressives, from left-wing people, are, I feel like, exact critiques that you could make of abortion, of murdering babies, and the greatest injustice that we're facing in our time today. But it all does come back to this idea that human beings they have dignity. They've been created in the image of God. And that idea has been rejected. I guess my question is, with the younger generations growing up, and there's a lot of this ideology, that rejects the image of God, rejects the dignity of the human person. What do you do to reinstate that idea? How do you get a whole generation of people to believe that human beings have dignity, even if they are not born yet?
Well, there are really only two options.
Yes.
Either you believe in the profound, inherent, and equal dignity of each and every member of the human family, or you don't. If you don't, that means you believe that some people are superior to others.
Yes.
If you do, you believe that you have the fundamental rights you have simply in virtue of your humanity, not in virtue of your race, your sex, your ethnicity, your size, your location, your stage of development, your condition of dependency. So it's one or the other. Now, when I talk to my progressive friends, I have many progressive friends, you can imagine, living where I live and teaching where I teach, they will tell you, oh, yes, I believe in the profound, inherent, and equal dignity of each and every member of the human family. Then I say, then the only question is, who's human and who's not?
Yes. And
that's not a normative ethical question. That's a straightforward question of science. And we know actually the answer to that question. There's no mystery about, sometimes people will say, oh, there's great mystery about when the life of a new human being begins. There's no mystery there. No. We've known it for decades, indeed for more than a century. No, we do know that the child in the womb is a whole living member of the species Homo sapiens, is a human being. So if you believe in human rights you have in virtue of your humanity, fundamental human rights, then you've got to believe in the fundamental rights of the child in the womb. If you don't, then, okay, you got a different view, but don't tell me that you believe in the profound, inherent, and equal dignity of each and every member of the human family. Make up your mind, one way or the other.
Yes. I have to run now, but I wanted to say this is why you need to see The American Miracle. The American Miracle movie is going to be in over 1,000 theaters, we hope, June 9, 10, 11. Go to AmericanMiracleMovie.com to get your tickets. And there's so much here because every generation has to understand these principles that are laid out in the founding, and they've been done so well. So I'm going to leave this. You can continue, but I will talk with you later. Thank you so much. Thanks, Tim.
Thanks, Tim. I'm going to have to go as well.
Thanks, guys. This is great. Thanks for doing this.
Andy, just one thought in wrapping up.
Yes.
You've got a couple of professors here, and we're talking about some of these deep worldview and philosophical principles. But I would just say that the film is so interesting and fun to watch. It tells a great story, and it tells it very well. The actors are excellent, and so it kind of combines the world of ideas with just a fantastic story.
Yes. And, I was just going to finish by just, can I ask you guys one quick question, just because I want to sort of set something forward, set a vision forward, because this is a movie about, patriotism is about the founding of America. We're coming up on the 250-year anniversary of this country. And I just want to, I guess, get your guys' perspective on what happens if we, as a society, as a culture, and as a country, reject the hand of God, reject the hand of providence in our country. What happens going forward? And I guess what encouragement would you have, or what call do you have to the younger generations to not reject that?
John Adams famously said, when asked about the Constitution that the Constitutional Convention had produced and would be proposed for ratification, that this Constitution is made only for a moral and religious people and will not serve for the governance of any other kind of people. Adams was no fool. He was a very brilliant man. As I say, he was the greatest scholar of the founding generation. And he was absolutely right about that. If we're to be self-governing as a people, we need to be self-governing people, that is, masters of our own passions. We need virtues. And those virtues don't just sort of suddenly appear out of nowhere. They're cultivated by us. We're formed in them largely by what sociologists call the institutions of civil society. And chief among those are the family and the religious community, the church or other religious community. How do you get people capable of carrying on this grand experiment in ordered liberty and Republican government? Government can't produce them. No court can mandate them. An economic system can't generate them. If you get people with the virtues needed to sustain government of this type, self-government, Republican government, if you get them because of mom and dad and grandma and grandpa and auntie and uncle and teacher and pastor and coach and librarian, the people who work with children, with young men and women, and know them by name every day, who shape them, who know their particular sensitivities, their particular vulnerabilities, and so forth. It's a retail business. It's not wholesale. So Republican government can't do without such people. They are a necessary ingredient in the success of Republican government, but Republican government can't by itself produce them.
Yes.
You need those institutions of civil society, and family and faith, as Adams said, are the two cornerstones. They're the pillars that enable us to produce the kinds of people who can govern themselves.
Good.
Yeah, beautifully said. This question came up at the very end of the film, and we were able to talk about Alexander Solzhenitsyn's famous "Men Have Forgotten God" speech, talking about how the people, when the news of the Bolshevik Revolution was spreading out into the countryside, and he tells the story of how the old people were weeping in the fields, and one of them said to him, "These great disasters have befallen Russia because men have forgotten God." And so I think that, we were commenting at the end of the film that there's a warning in that for our country, that we have a great inheritance as a result of those founding Judeo-Christian principles that informed our Declaration and our Constitution. But if we forget God, those words written on a piece of paper will not ensure the maintenance of self-government and a good and godly society. We have to find our foundational identity in God for the whole system to work, as Adam said and as Professor George just explained. So, yeah.
Yes. Well, Robert, George, Steve Meyer, thanks so much for doing this. This movie is fantastic, and I really hope people will go watch it.
Yeah. Thanks for having us on. Yeah.
Great to be with you, Steve.
Yeah, you too. It's good to see you again.